I'm Annalise Stratman at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. On behalf of the Knowledge Hub team, we welcome you to the Knowledge Hub Presents series. The Knowledge Hub Presents series features information on trauma and violence-informed research and practice developed by members of the trauma-informed community of practice in their work related to preventing and addressing family violence. I want to acknowledge our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoik, and the Chinantang nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. Welcome to today's presentation entitled Navigating Ethical Challenges in Trauma and Violence-Informed Research Toward a Training Module for Gender-Based Violence Researchers. This presentation today is presented by Dr. Robert Nonomura, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Western University. His research specializations are in social inequality, gender-based violence, knowledge mobilization, and the sociology of morality. He is a former research associate with the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, where he worked on projects, this one, the Knowledge Hub, the Learning Network, and supporting the health of survivors of family violence in family law proceedings, which is now known as Awareness to Action. He has also contributed to the development of trauma and violence-informed research ethics through book chapters such as Social Inclusion Through Trauma and Violence-Informed Research, a focus on survivors of violence, and the fact-funded report Toward a Trauma and Violence-Informed Research Ethics module, Critical Considerations and Recommendations. He is currently working to develop a problem-based learning module that supports gender-based violence researchers in applying TBI principles in navigating the ethical complexities that often arise in this work. So at this moment, I'd like to say, welcome, Robert, and we're so pleased to have you joining us today to talk about this topic.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Anna Lee. Thank you also, Jade, Jessica, Jenna, for your facilitation and organization of our discussion today. The place I'm speaking, and of course, thank you to all the people in attendance. The place I'm speaking to you today from is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Chinantang peoples. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Given the theme of ethics in our talk today, I wanted to share a few details about the ethical sensibilities of this dish with one spoon relationship as a way to kind of orient our talk. We can think of the dish with one spoon as not just a metaphor, but a moral and political agreement capturing the relationships that Indigenous peoples and settlers have agreed to practice on the specific geographic region in which we live, a recognition that we all eat out of the dish with only one spoon. And accordingly, we have a shared responsibility to ensure that the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures we share it with. And importantly, in this relationship, there are no knives at the table, representing that we all need to keep the peace. So with that in mind, I hope that we can take a moment to reflect and give thanks for the continued stewardship of lands where we all live, where each of us live, work, and are in relationship with one another, and to also take account of the ongoing injustices of colonial violence that we each have a stake in confronting in our work, our communities, and in our minds. I want to thank Anna Lee also for the introduction of my work and my relationship with CREVAC. I do have a deep appreciation for the work being done at CREVAC. As Anna Lee mentioned, I was a research associate at the center for a period of time from 2019 to 2022. Currently, I'm an assistant professor at Western University. I teach introductory courses on social inequality and sociological theory, as well as an upper year seminar on LGBTQ2S+ populations. And here today, I want to talk about a project that is closely related to CREVAC and the Knowledge Hub, which concerns research ethics and the challenges that practitioners sometimes navigate in research involving trauma and violence informed GBV interventions. So I'll first summarize some broad concepts around trauma and violence informed approaches to research and care. I recognize that this is an area which many on the call are already knowledgeable, but I'm also hopeful that today's discussion can be accessible to those who are early in connecting with this field, perhaps thinking about how they might enhance the safety of their research design, support their RAs, or focus alignment between research and service objectives within a project. So hopefully some brief conceptual review will be helpful here. Our learning objectives will be mostly addressed in that second part that we see on the screen, where we'll discuss these ethical challenges for GBV intervention research. GBV research can be impacted by macro, meso, and micro level social factors in interconnecting ways. And I want to discuss a report that I worked on with the Knowledge Hub that examines how these factors can produce ethically complex challenges for TBI research. To address these challenges, I'll share an example of how the report uses vignettes and problem-based learning approaches as a strategy for how we might translate the hard-won practical experiences of TBI practitioners to new researchers, enhancing their ethical decision-making and equipping them with knowledge and strategies to practice safer research with participants. And we'll conclude with some future directions for the project. Overall, my hope is that today's discussion can open a dialogue around the possibilities for developing a TBI research ethics training module, a project which might incorporate the rich insights of current TBI practitioners and transmit this to colleagues across the GBV sector and to future researchers in the field. Now, it looks like oh, there's my English slides. All right. I assume the audience on a call like this is probably at least a bit familiar with the concept of trauma-informed care, that important idea that acknowledges the role that traumatic stress plays in people's lives and that responds to people's needs accordingly. Trauma-informed care is wide-ranging, addressing experiences such as abuse, neglect, war, disaster, or other traumatic events. TIC has also made important contributions to how we think of research ethics. It's brought greater awareness of the need for agency, dignity, and safety among participants, and it incorporates their voices into ensuring that research does not cause re-traumatization. A trauma and violence informed framework draws upon these important insights, but it's distinguished by an abiding focus on the impact of violence. And for the purposes of gender-based violence research, this focus opens up some especially relevant possibilities for addressing the lived experiences of research participants who may have experienced trauma. As the Canadian health researchers Colleen Barco and Pamela Ponick note, a TBI perspective expands the concept of trauma-informed support to account for the intersections of systemic and interpersonal violence and structural inequalities on a person's life. In the most straightforward sense, then, although a TBI approach may be less applicable to certain traumatic events like a car crash or a natural disaster, it gives us remarkably sharp and versatile lenses for examining issues such as domestic violence, misogynoir, or colonial violence at multiple intersections and across various levels of analysis. And so, for instance, here I've summarized some general ethical ideas promoted in a TBI approach to research and care. A TBI approach places particular focus on the interconnecting impacts of interpersonal and structural violence on a person's life. It prioritizes the empowerment and agency of survivors, especially in the face of colonial, racial, gendered, ableist, and heterosexist oppression. It rejects the default of a single axis approach to trauma and violence and instead takes an intersectional, collaborative approach to dismantling oppressive systems and relations, both at the societal level and within its own methodologies. And accordingly, it aims to create emotionally, physically, and culturally safe environments for participants and researchers. In a nutshell, TBI approaches have the capacity to raise and enrich the ethical standards we uphold across a range of interdisciplinary research undertakings related to trauma and violence, from social work to public health advocacy to social science research methodology. And so it's within that context that I began working with the Knowledge Hub to develop a resource that could distill these ideas into an examination of key considerations for integrating TBI approaches into research ethics. The Knowledge Hub facilitated a community of practice working group representing 17 violence intervention projects from across Canada. The working group met on 3 separate occasions to identify ethical challenges that practitioners faced when conducting research on GBV interventions and collaboratively explored trauma and violence informed strategies for addressing these challenges. The aim of the project then was to address the question, what challenges do practitioners face in ethically conducting trauma and violence informed research on GBV intervention projects? From these discussions, I helped to write a report for the Public Health Agency of Canada highlighting the need for researcher training that goes beyond standard best practices and Tri-Council recommendations. Specifically, we highlighted examples of ethically fraught situations that can leave even the most experienced GBV researcher feeling uncertain and possibly unprepared to respond in real time. And so the key point is this. Research councils can establish best practice recommendations for investigators to incorporate into their research protocols. Professors can teach students about the importance of ethical research design, and agencies can advocate about the importance of participant safety and empowerment. And everyone will get it in theory, but what does it look like in real life, where matters of interpersonal violence, systemic oppression, and trauma responses have the potential to arise in unpredictable and sometimes uncontrollable ways? And what does this look like when best practice principles such as safety and empowerment of participants point researchers in conflicting directions? These are the deeper thematic concerns that arose from the working group, and it's where I believe a TVI perspective calls on us to think critically about how we can train practitioners to navigate ethically complex situations. Specifically, the report advocates the application of situation-based learning approaches to research ethics, and especially in regards to training. And it uses vignettes to illustrate real-world dilemmas and reimagine possibilities then for TVI social research. And so we organized the discussion around 3 critical themes emerging from common ethical tensions that were encountered by TVI intervention researchers. These themes are ethical tensions between a principle of safety and a principle of empowerment, ethical tensions for research practitioners whose engagement with survivors of trauma and violence sometimes create a dual role relationship in which their interactions with survivors force them to move from the role of researcher into the role of service provider or clinician, and ethical tensions arising between a principle of organizational collaboration and a principle of maintaining institutional boundaries between support service mandates and researcher objectives. And so for our purposes today, I'll just be discussing the first 2 of these tensions, but I'd be happy to elaborate on the third if folks had questions in the Q&A, and we can elaborate if there's some interest there. But turning to the first tension, this potential conflict between safety and empowerment. As a general principle, the empowerment and safety of all participants, clients and researchers alike, are of paramount ethical importance in TVI approaches to research, and they're a feature requirement of any research ethics board protocol. But given the complex effects of trauma and violence that can emerge for individuals, there can be challenging tensions between the need to empower participants' agency, choice, and decision-making on one hand, and the need to ensure safety, reduce the risk of harm, and prevent re-traumatization on the other hand. This is especially the case where the complex effects and contexts of violence are part of an intervention research relationship. Complicating matters further is the fact that therapeutic protection has traditionally consisted of an external authority unilaterally judging how and when to shield the passive victim from harm. And so the TVI Ethics Working Group identified various situations where the line between a responsibility to protect and a paternalistic protectionism was not always self-evident. Next, the working group highlighted how TVI practitioners often find themselves in situations where conventional boundaries between research and support roles may be less clear-cut. So while I might teach my undergraduate students why it's ethically important for researchers and clinicians to avoid dual role relationships, here we know that the real world of GBV interventions are a lot more complex. Clinicians or support workers are sometimes tasked with research responsibilities, and researchers may need to move into a support role for participants who experience unanticipated trauma responses or vulnerability to re-traumatization. And researchers may require for themselves support due to the vicarious trauma taken on from their work. We can also note at the macro and meso levels how the limitations of funding might further complicate these situations. When research projects bring much needed and otherwise scarce funding to the table, social service agencies can experience pressure to subordinate their mandates to the needs and interests of their partnered research organizations. And members of our working group noted that the power imbalances brought on by financial matters can produce the unintended burden of adding the requirement of research projects on top of service providers' ordinary operations. And at the micro level, clients are, of course, aware of how hard agencies have to fight for funding, and they may sense an obligation to participate in an agency's research. This might not rise to the level of coercion, but it is nevertheless a factor that may impact their responses to questions or their comfortability with withdrawing their consent midway through a project. Overall, and so I'll just mention we'll skip this third one for now and revisit it perhaps in the Q&A, or I'm happy to discuss it at a later date. But overall, interviews with frontline researchers and practitioners make it clear that there is a significant need for more comprehensive resources and training in order for the practice of TVI approaches to research to fully match the considerable potential suggested by TVI ethical principles. Gender-based violence researchers engage with subject matters that are, by their very nature, fraught with social injustice and interpersonal harm. And such harms and injustices are often ongoing at the time of research. So moving from the exploratory question about barriers and to the practical question of recommendations, we might ask, how can frontline researchers prepare to address unexpected, complicated, or emotionally distressing ethical dilemmas that may not be anticipated in research protocols? And what is to be done in situations where ethical principles appear to point a researcher in various directions all at once? And how do we ensure that the research process does not reproduce the structural injustices that it is exploring or intending to improve? So in the report, we present some hypothetical vignettes of scenarios likely to reflect the complex ethical situations that working group members encountered and described in their practice. The report then uses these vignettes as a point of reference for highlighting key considerations for the practice of TBI research. So here's an example situation from the report. A research assistant is conducting phone interviews with gay men who responded to an online survey about their past experiences of victimization in intimate relationships, and who volunteered to talk more about their experiences in a follow-up phone interview. Tom, one of the volunteers for this part of the study, reported that he had previously lived with an abusive partner. He asked to be called during the day when his current partner was at work and the condo would be quieter. The researcher called, as arranged, around noon. They were 15 minutes into the interview when it was interrupted by someone in the background who seemed to have walked into the room and overheard Tom answering questions. The researcher could hear this person angrily confront Tom about sharing private information about their relationship. The phone sounded like it was put down, and the researcher could hear raised voices but could not make out what was being said. The researcher was trying to decide whether or not to hang up and call 911 when Tom came back on the phone. There was silence in the background, and Tom reported that he was in a private space. He stated that he wanted to continue the interview. Tom started answering questions again, but soon after began sobbing, though he seemed to be trying to muffle the sound. And so the researcher wondered whether he should continue with the interview given what he had just heard. And he worried about Tom's safety and wondered whether he should call for help. And so this is one of 6 sample problems that we explore in the report as illustration of some of these challenges that often arise in TVI intervention research. And whether you're listening on the call or whether you're watching the recording later, I invite you maybe to reflect on this yourself. If you're live and want to share your own reflections in the chat, I invite you to do so. And perhaps we can have a conversation that runs parallel to the remainder of the presentation. If you're watching the recording later on, perhaps even pause and think about what kinds of responses come to mind. When integrating this literature into my own teaching, I sometimes ask students questions like, what does your research training suggest that you should do in this situation? And what can be done to make this study more trauma and violence informed? And I can tell you that after 3 years of discussing this with fourth year undergraduate social science students in my courses, and also discussing with colleagues and graduate students informally, uh, people are often consistently at a loss for what to do. They might know the best practices from a textbook, but those principles don't prepare them for situations that are less than the best. And so I think that this reflects a gap in how we introduce research methods to post-secondary students and research assistants. And it's a gap that could be filled in a practical and engaging way through situation-based learning modules. Overall, I'm proposing that situation-based learning provides practitioners with opportunities to promote critical reflections that can integrate trauma-informed research into various teaching and learning objectives. On this slide, I've distilled down some specific strategies for promoting safety, choice, and empowerment, which we discuss in depth in the report. For instance, regarding the immediate situation between Tom and the researcher, we talk about how TVI perspectives can enhance our ability to assess crisis situations. Statistically, we know that LGBTQ individuals face disproportionately high rates of IPV, and so considerations of risk factors and potentials for harm and re-traumatization, especially given Tom's past experience of abuse, are all relevant. We also discussed the importance of resource sheets that are tailored to the specific needs of participants, especially with populations like LGBTQ people, but additionally for those who may require further specialized resources relating to intersections of immigration, sex work, or culture. Our discussions of constructing TBI research protocols highlight some additional considerations. Awareness of macro level factors like social stigma may require a serious consideration of confidentiality and safety. Protocols might include the use of neutral or coded language and safety plans with participants. At the meso level, we can think of how institutional protocols can ensure access to a second phone for emergency communications. And we discuss how this can ensure that researchers don't disconnect from participants. And at the micro level, we can recognize the importance of debriefing. We discuss the impacts that this work can have on researchers who may share similar social locations with participants or who may have their own past histories of trauma, and thus the need for projects to incorporate protocols for debrief and support counseling for researchers is paramount. So, by way of wrap up, what I hope to have done today is to honor the reality that many on this call and many of our colleagues already know from practical experience that effective TVI care and research requires a depth of knowledge, critical thinking, careful planning, and compassion that goes far beyond anything that can be captured in a list of philosophical principles. The realities of GBV confront practitioners with complex ethical problems. Therefore, it's important that research ethics training equip practitioners with the skills to navigate these problems. Uh, so, thinking ahead to some future directions, then, problem-based learning has been demonstrated to be an effective means of accomplishing this in areas of health, trauma, and violence training. Case study analyses of real-world dilemmas provide researchers with a flexible, adaptable medium for training directly to the kinds of challenges that its practitioners will face. Additionally, this problem-solving format can help illuminate epistemic and practical gaps in knowledge. It can provoke reflections on potentials for harm not previously considered, and it can challenge us to go beyond our conceptual awareness of oppression to find concrete strategies for implementing anti-oppressive methodological practices. Finally, the assumption has always been that such a module would be undertaken collaboratively. I have in mind here a model such as communities of practice, which enable the cultivation of cross-disciplinary insights and an orientation to mutually interdependent learning. Discussions of these situations among research teams can help team members of different statuses, roles, and duties to be more understanding, responsive, and supportive of their colleagues and the clients and participants they serve. And so the next steps for developing the project are as follows. I'm in the project of adapting the vignettes in the PHAC report into some formats suitable for teaching and learning modules. We want to further develop the project's rationale with current teaching and learning best practices. We want to develop and pilot the full TVI training module proposed in the report, which encountered some roadblocks due to the pandemic, and then further develop the theory and practice of TVI approaches, specifically in the area of research ethics. My hope for our field is that TVI perspectives become an integral part of research methods training for undergraduates and RAs, how we theorize violence across the social science disciplines, and how researchers contribute productively to supporting the safety and empowerment of gender-based violence survivors in our society. So I want to thank you for your attendance. Welcome any questions, comments, and I'm hopeful for opening up a dialogue around this subject as we move forward. Thank you so much.
Robert, thank you for that great presentation. That was awesome. I'm now being joined by Jenna Lopez, who is the research coordinator with the Knowledge Hub. And there's been active discussion in the chat and in the Q&A regarding this. And so we're going to have time for a couple of questions here. And Jenna, would you like to start?
Jenna, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I'll start with a question that came through from the Q&A box, Robert. Have you ever experienced challenges with REBs being overly paternalistic in their requirements? How would you manage that?
Um, I'll say one of the things that in my own research, given my specialization more along the theoretical and knowledge mobilization side, I've been attempting to synthesize a lot of the experiences of practitioners and researchers. So I can't speak directly to the prevalence of this kind of paternalism in my own research. I know from the literature, and I'm sure others have experienced these kinds of challenges themselves. What I can say, I suppose, on the positive side, at least at Western, is I was surprised actually to find in an engagement with a representative from the REB that they were actually sharing this document on their website. Actually, it was at King's that they were sharing our document. So I recognize that this is a challenge often where REBs might be overly concerned with protectionism in ways that effectively deny the agency of and the choice of participants to share their own stories and thus to silence them. I think that the best I can speak to is I would recommend possibly using the report as support in response to those that feedback from REBs, and also I can attest that the literature provides strong arguments that could help to push back on empirical and philosophical grounds against those sorts of more traditional concerns. Those would be my thoughts.
Thanks, Robert.
I'd be happy to also, we could see about maybe putting together some resources that kind of were used in supporting this document, because it was one of the original things that we first needed to initiate when we were writing it back in 2020.
Yeah. One of the things that we've noticed, we've been doing a little bit of research as well regarding where people are at when it comes to doing trauma and violence informed research. And we see that quite often, although people are trying to use a trauma and violence informed approach, they're tending to use other research frameworks than a trauma and violence informed research framework. So community-based, feminist, intersectional, participatory. And we see now that some people are starting to write about and develop trauma and violence informed research frameworks. And we're wondering how that might, how thinking about these ethical things concerns might help build a framework, a research framework. Did I lose you, Robert? Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I felt like that was a nice definitive statement on it, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Jenna.
Whether
Okay, we have another question about the report that you were speaking to.
Mhm.
Somebody asked how much discussion was put into REB or ethics boards and their need to be more trauma and violence informed. This person said possibly next steps or discussions.
Um, that wasn't a primary focus of the report as much as an attempt to navigate the institutional context that people that practitioners currently face. I agree with the person's kind of follow-up point that possibly next steps for discussion. Absolutely. I think that continued dialogue with members of research ethics boards become kind of paramount for how we might develop some of these training modules, and also for using maybe these kinds of situation-based approaches to illuminate the how and why of certain approaches that are taken by TBI practitioners. And so I think that one possible way forward that does align with what we cover in the report is this idea of presenting vignettes that are representative of these real world situations. And through engaging in dialogue about these matters, we can hopefully come to various forms of mutual understanding about the limitations, but also possibilities of how we can approach our research more ethically. But again, that also addresses the empowerment aspect, the choice of participants to consent and share their stories.
That's about all the time we have for today. Robert, I want to thank you so much for your presentation. Now, you mentioned that possibly you're looking for people to kind of work through this with you and think about it. And how might they get a hold of you?
My email is I can put it in the chat right now, I suppose. But for those on the recording, it's rnonomur@uwo.ca. I'm in the sociology department at Western. Like I said, and I appreciate you mentioning it, Annalie. This is an opportunity, hopefully, to open up a discussion and to find colleagues who share these interests. I like to think of my role in a lot of this GBV work as trying to facilitate and synthesize some of this work, and to bring to light, not only the experiences of survivors, but also the hard-won experiences of researchers and practitioners. And if there's ways I can support the field in that way, that's really my core motivation in this project. So I look forward to chatting and collaborating with anybody who's interested.
Awesome. And we'll forward any requests we get as well for you.
Mhm.
So thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you, Robert, and thank you to the Knowledge Hub team, to Jade, who is the technical wizard behind everything we do. Thank you, Jenna, for assisting with the Q&A this afternoon, Katrina, Jessica, and Sabri. And thank you, Sylvie, for providing interpretation in the background. When this webinar closes, you'll receive an evaluation link. Please take a moment to fill it out. It helps us plan for future events. And thank you very much for your time today.